True War Encounters. Jake McNiece. How Jake McNiece used Reising M50 in 1943 with close-quarter instinct to clear a building. The Reising M50 felt like a lie in McNiece's hands. Too light, too fragile. The magazine housing sat crooked. The bolt moved with a grinding hesitation that made his jaw clench, and every instinct he'd built over 2 years of combat screamed that this weapon would fail him when it mattered most. He'd pulled it from a supply crate 3 hours earlier outside Gela, after his Thompson took shrapnel from a German 88 that had bracketed their position near the Sicilian coast. Now, crouched behind a stone wall 50 yards from a fortified farmhouse on a moonless July night, McNiece stared at the submachine gun and thought about all the ways it could kill him. The farmhouse squatted on a hillside above the coastal road, its thick walls pocked with firing slits. German voices drifted through the olive trees, sharp, disciplined, coordinating. Intelligence said a Wehrmacht communications unit was operating inside, relaying troop movements to panzer columns, pushing toward the Allied beachhead. The 101st Airborne had been scattered across Sicily for 3 days since the disastrous night drop, and McNiece's makeshift squad, 6 paratroopers from 3 different units, had orders to eliminate the threat before dawn. No artillery support, no backup. Just get inside, clear it, destroy the radios, and disappear before reinforcements arrived. McNiece checked the Reising's action again. Sand. He could feel it grinding in the receiver, that sickening rasp that meant the weapon was one trigger pull away from locking up completely. The Reising was notorious for jamming in dirty conditions, and Sicily was nothing but dust, olive pollen, and burnt cordite. Beside him, Corporal Hayes whispered, "Sarge, we should wait for another weapon. That thing's gonna lock up on you." McNiece didn't answer. There was no time. The Germans would move the equipment by sunrise, and the narrow window between their patrol rotation, exactly 12 minutes they'd timed it, was closing fast. He'd built his reputation on explosives, bridges, bunkers, roadblocks, precision demolitions executed under fire with an almost casual contempt for danger. But tonight required something different. The farmhouse's walls were too thick for grenades to penetrate effectively, and setting charges would alert every German within a mile. This was infantry work, room to room, close quarters. The kind of fighting McNiece had trained for but rarely executed, because officers kept him on demolition details where his undisciplined attitude didn't spook the by-the-book planners. The symbolic weight of the Reising pressed against his ribs. An unreliable weapon for an unreliable mission led by an unreliable NCO. Perfect symmetry. He thought about Oklahoma, about the oil fields where he'd learned to trust his hands and instincts over what foreman told him was proper procedure. That instinct had kept him alive through Normandy's hedgerows and would have to carry him now through whatever waited inside that farmhouse. At 0247 hours, the patrol rotation shifted. 2 Germans stepped out the rear door, cigarettes glowing as they walked toward the cistern. McNiece moved. No signal, no hesitation. He crossed the open ground in 15 seconds, boots silent on hard-packed earth, and flattened himself against the farmhouse's southern wall. Hayes and 2 others followed, shadows peeling from shadows. The remaining paratroopers stayed back, covering the windows. McNiece tested the door. Ajar. The Reising felt slick in his palms. He pushed through. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The interior smelled like sweat, tobacco, and overheated radio tubes. A kerosene lamp burned low in the first room, empty except for scattered maps and a field telephone still connected by wire that snaked out a window toward the German lines. McNiece advanced through a narrow corridor, plaster walls close enough to brush his shoulders. The Reising's front sight caught on his jacket twice. He could hear Hayes breathing behind him, controlled, but too fast. They'd trained for this at Tokoa. Running through mock villages and shooting houses, but training never included the weight of knowing your weapon might betray you at the worst possible moment. Intelligence had said single-story structure. Intelligence had been wrong. Through a doorway to his left, McNiece glimpsed stairs climbing toward a second floor. He froze. That changed everything. The stairwell would be a fatal funnel, and they'd have to clear 2 levels instead of 1. He glanced back at Hayes, saw the same realization in his eyes. Hayes mouthed, "Abort?" McNiece shook his head. They were already inside. German reinforcements would arrive within 20 minutes if the patrol reported back. There was no clean exit now. Voices echoed from deeper inside, casual, unaware. McNiece's heart hammered. The Reising felt heavier with each step, its unreliability a third presence in the corridor. He thought about Lieutenant Morrison back at the staging area, who'd argued against this mission entirely. You want to send 6 men into a fortified position with scattered gear and no support? That's not tactics, McNiece. That's suicide. But the beachhead couldn't hold if German armor kept getting perfect intelligence about Allied positions, and somebody had to shut down that radio net before dawn. McNiece edged toward the room where the voices originated. Through the doorway, he could see shadows moving. 2 Germans, maybe 3, hunched over a radio set, headphones clamped over their ears, transcribing coded messages. One held a cigarette between his fingers, gesturing as he spoke into the handset. They looked exhausted, young, human. McNiece pushed that thought aside. He'd learned in Normandy that seeing the enemy as human didn't change what had to happen. It just made the nightmares more specific. He felt the Reising's action one more time, still grinding, still wrong. Hayes moved up beside him, M1 carbine ready, and McNiece saw something in his face that hadn't been there 3 days ago. Not quite trust, but acceptance. Hayes had been skeptical of the Filthy 13's reputation, of McNiece's casual disregard for spit and polish, of the whole mythology around the crazy demolitions NCO. But scattered across Sicily with no clear chain of command, Hayes had started to understand why men followed McNiece despite everything, because when plans collapsed and gear failed and officers were nowhere to be found, McNiece made decisions and lived with them. The German with the cigarette looked up. McNiece squeezed the trigger. The Reising stuttered 3 rounds, then stopped, jammed. The German shouted, reaching for his rifle, and McNiece's instinct took over. McNiece threw himself forward, swinging the useless Reising like a club. The steel stock connected with the German's jaw, bone cracking, the man collapsing sideways into the radio equipment. Vacuum tubes shattered. The second German lunged with a bayonet. McNiece twisted, felt the blade slice through his jacket, and drove his knee into the man's gut. They crashed into a wooden table. The kerosene lamp fell, spilling oil that caught fire in a thin line across the floor. Hayes burst through the doorway, M1 carbine barking twice, dropping the 3rd German who'd been reaching for an MP40 in the corner. McNiece kicked the bayonet aside, breathing hard, adrenaline spiking so violently his hands shook. He grabbed the Reising, slapped the magazine housing, racked the bolt with savage force, clearing the jam through brute strength and muscle memory. The bolt locked, live round chambered. He looked at Hayes, saw smoke curling from the carbine's muzzle, saw the same stunned realization in both their eyes. The mission had just announced itself to everyone in the building. Above them, boots thundered across floorboards. Voices shouted in German, sharp, urgent, organizing. The second floor that intelligence hadn't mentioned was now fully alert, and McNiece and his squad were trapped at the bottom of what would become a killing box if they didn't move immediately. He glanced at the stairs. Narrow, exposed. Climbing them would mean presenting yourself as a perfect target to anyone waiting at the top. But staying put meant getting surrounded when the Germans outside responded to the gunfire. Through the broken window, McNiece heard diesel engines. He moved to the sill, risked a glance. Headlights on the access road, 2 trucks, maybe 3, rolling toward the farmhouse faster than expected. German reinforcements ahead of schedule. The 12-minute window had collapsed to maybe 4. The mission was falling apart in real time, every assumption of the brief proving wrong. The building's layout, the enemy strength, the response time, the reliability of the gear. McNiece made his choice in half a second. Upstairs. Now. Hayes stared at him. That's suicide, Sarge. McNiece checked the Reising's magazine. Maybe 15 rounds left if it didn't jam again. So is staying here. He started climbing. The stairwell was everything he'd feared. Narrow, steep, exposed. Halfway up, a German appeared at the landing, MP40 raised. McNiece fired from the hip, trusting instinct over aim. The Reising bucked, 5 rounds, controlled burst, and the submachine gun that had betrayed him seconds earlier now fed smoothly, rounds stitching across the doorframe. The German fell backward. McNiece kept climbing, boots pounding wood, the burned oil smell mixing with cordite. Another soldier emerged from a bedroom doorway. McNiece pivoted, fired again. The Reising barked, the German retreated. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. McNiece kicked the bedroom door fully open, swept the room, empty except for overturned bunks and scattered German gear. His lungs burned. The Reising felt different now, like it had decided to cooperate for reasons beyond mechanical logic. Behind him, Hayes cleared another room, movements sharp and efficient. They could hear the trucks outside screeching to a halt, German commands shouting orders to surround the building. The window had closed completely. Through a doorway to his right, McNiece glimpsed the main communications setup. 2 more radios, encryption equipment, maps tacked to walls showing Allied positions with disturbing accuracy. A German operator sat frozen at the table, headphones around his neck, staring at the American paratrooper who'd just appeared in the doorway like a vengeful ghost. The operator's hand moved toward a Luger on the table. McNiece fired. The Reising stuttered. 3 rounds, and the man slumped forward onto the equipment. The radio sparked, tubes crackling, then went silent. "West window!" Hayes shouted from below. McNiece spun, saw what Hayes had seen, more headlights, a full convoy now, blocking every exit route they'd scouted. They had maybe 90 seconds before Germans stormed both floors simultaneously. He grabbed a German stick grenade from the floor, pulled the cord and tossed it down the stairwell as covering fire. The explosion shook the walls, plaster raining down, smoke filling the corridor. "Out!" McNiece barked. "Now!" He and Hayes bolted for the rear window, kicked through the shutters, and dropped 8 feet onto hard ground. The impact jarred McNiece's knees, but he rolled, came up running. Reising clutched against his chest. They sprinted across open ground toward the olive grove, tracers cutting through the air behind them. MG-42 fire from the trucks, stitching the earth where they'd been seconds earlier. The grove swallowed them. McNiece zigzagged between trees, branches whipping his face, lungs screaming for oxygen. Behind them, the farmhouse erupted with German voices, shouting, coordinating, organizing pursuit. But the darkness and the scattered terrain worked in the paratroopers' favor now. They were trained for chaos. The Germans were trained for order. They ran for 20 minutes, using every trick Tokoa had taught them, changing direction unpredictably, moving through water to break scent trails, staying low in the folds of terrain. When the sounds of pursuit finally faded, McNiece allowed himself to stop. He collapsed behind a stone wall a mile from the farmhouse, chest heaving, hands shaking from adrenaline crash. Hayes dropped beside him, panting, grinning despite the exhaustion. McNiece ejected the Reising's magazine, empty. He let the weapon fall into the dirt and stared at it. The submachine gun that should have gotten him killed had somehow worked exactly when it needed to. Not perfectly, not reliably, but enough. He thought about all the ways that mission could have ended differently, all the moments where one more jam, one more malfunction would have meant dying on that stairwell or in that smoke-filled room. The central secret, The truth McNiece would never put in any after-action report was how terrified he'd been on that stairwell. Not the manageable fear that sharpened reflexes and kept you moving, but the kind that made your legs want to quit, that whispered you were about to die in a nameless farmhouse for a mission that would probably get classified anyway. The rising jamming in the first room hadn't been bad luck. It had been inevitable. McNiece had known the weapon would fail, had felt it in the grinding action from the moment he picked it up, and he'd gone in anyway because someone had to, and the men with him believed his instinct would somehow compensate for faulty gear and bad intelligence. That belief was the heaviest weight he carried. Hayes sat against the stone wall, cleaning his carbine with a piece of torn cloth, hands steady now that the adrenaline was fading. "Hell of a play, Sarge," he said quietly. McNiece didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about the moment on the stairs when the Reising had worked, that burst of 5 rounds that dropped the German on the landing. There'd been no mechanical reason for it to function. The action had still been full of sand and grit. By every logical standard, the weapon should have jammed again, but it hadn't. And McNiece knew that wasn't skill or instinct or any of the things men would later attribute to him. It was luck, pure, arbitrary luck. The kind that saves you one night and abandons you the next. "You know what the worst part is?" McNiece said, voice rough. Hayes looked at him. "What we did in there, clearing those rooms, making those calls, it worked. This time. But I made 3 decisions that could have killed everyone. Using that weapon, going upstairs, staying when we should have pulled back." He picked up the Reising, turned it over in his hands. "The citation or report or whatever they write will make it sound like I knew what I was doing, like there was a plan." Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then, "Was there?" McNiece almost laughed. "I threw a submachine gun at a man's face because it jammed at the worst possible moment. That's not tactics, that's panic with a lucky outcome." He paused. "The next mission, or the one after that, the same instinct that saved us tonight, might get someone killed. And I'll still be the guy everyone expects to figure it out." The weight wasn't just the fear. It was knowing that other men's survival depended on his improvisations in situations no training manual covered, and that eventually, mathematically, inevitably, one of those improvisations would fail. The real truth of close-quarter instinct wasn't that it always worked. It was that you learned to make split-second choices while accepting that any one of them could be catastrophically wrong. The farmhouse glowed orange in the distance, flames rising from where their grenade had caught something flammable. The radio net was silent now. The mission was complete, and McNiece carried the knowledge that the next time might not go the same way. The official report, when it finally came, contained exactly 4 sentences. "Reconnaissance element engaged enemy communications facility vicinity, Gela, Sicily, 11th July 1943. Objectives destroyed. Enemy casualties estimated 6 to 8. Friendly casualties, none." The weapons used, the building's layout, the near disasters, McNiece's improvised close-quarter fighting with a malfunctioning submachine gun, none of it appeared in the record. 3 days later, a staff officer pulled McNiece aside and told him the mission was being classified. "Security reasons," the officer said, not meeting his eyes. McNiece understood. The operation had been too messy, too close to failure, too dependent on luck and rule-breaking. It didn't fit the narrative the army needed. The Reising M50 disappeared from his gear inventory the same day. No explanation, no replacement weapon issued. It was as if the entire night had been quietly erased. Hayes mentioned it once, weeks later, after they'd jumped into Normandy. "Remember that farmhouse with the radios?" McNiece had nodded but said nothing. What was there to say? That they'd succeeded despite everything that should have killed them. That close-quarter instinct was just a prettier name for educated gambling under fire. Hayes didn't press. Some missions live better as silence than stories. Years later, decades later, McNiece would be in a hardware store in Oklahoma, and someone would hand him a tool that felt wrong in his grip. Too light, balance off. And suddenly, he'd be back on that stairwell in Sicily, feeling the Reising buck against his shoulder, hearing Hayes's carbine barking behind him, smelling burnt oil and cordite mixing in smoke-filled rooms. The memory would hit so hard, he'd have to set the tool down and step outside, hands shaking the way they'd shaken that night in the olive grove. The legend of the Filthy 13 would grow in the years after the war. Wild stories, exaggerated tales, McNiece's name attached to operations both real and imagined. But the farmhouse near Gela would never appear in any of them. It remained classified, then forgotten, then omitted even from unofficial accounts. The men who'd been there rarely spoke of it. When they did, it was in fragments. That time with the radio, or remember that weapon that kept jamming, never the full story. Never the terror or the luck or the impossibly narrow margin between success and catastrophe. What McNiece understood in the decades after Sicily was that close-quarter instinct wasn't mystical or supernatural. It was pattern recognition built from fear, practiced through countless small encounters and deployed in moments where thinking took too long. It was the accumulated knowledge of what might work when everything else had failed. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, it was enough. The Reising M50 had been an unreliable weapon for an impossible mission, but on one July night in 1943, when every other variable had aligned against survival, it had worked. That was all McNiece could honestly say about it. If this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.